Hello, welcome. We'll give a minute before we start. All right. Liz, would you share the woman's prayer on the screen? Hello, everyone. I see some familiar faces. I see some new faces. Welcome, everyone. All right. So before we start the session, welcome to 2026 Episcopal Women's History Project Lenten Series. Today is the first session of 5. Please join us on Thursdays during Lent at 3 p.m. Eastern. We will start every session with a woman's prayer, which you can also find on our website. Let us pray. O God, creator of all life, bless the unsung lives of countless Christian women in every century who were your hands and feet, who kept alive your compassionate presence by feeding the hungry, nursing the sick, clothing the naked, comforting the sad, praying and petitioning, strengthening those in prison, teaching the stories, sowing and singing, weeping and rejoicing. Grant us the wisdom to discern our ministries in this day as our foremothers found theirs. Lead us in new and timeless forms of discipleship, and let us joyfully find our place in this procession of praise, offering our varied gifts and voices together with them and Mary, the mother of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Hello, welcome to 2026 Episcopal Women's History Project Lenten Series. My name is Yang Kim. I am the president of the board for EWHP. Before we start the amazing series, I have a few announcements since this is our first. We have our brand new website. It's ewhip.org, which Liz will put in the chat box. Please go in and check out, and please join us as a member so you can support the ministries that we are doing. As part of that, you are invited to our conference, which will be happening in June in Nashville, Tennessee. It is called Ministry in the Margins. It's going to happen from June 16th to 18th in Nashville, Tennessee, specifically in Sissel Farms and Center for Contemplative Justice. Our keynote speaker will be the Reverend Becca Stevens, the founder of Sissel Farms, and we will have many other wonderful papers presented. So please do join us. The conference registration is open, and you can find all of the details on our website. Today, you might have expected that we are going to meet the Reverend Mary Christ and for her to interview Reverend Dr. Anna Frank in Alaska. But with some of the weather issues and scheduling issues, we had to change the schedule. So we are going to hope to have the Reverend Mary Christ and Anna Frank on March 12th. And we switched the dates. So the one who was supposed to do March 12th series was our Vice President of Episcopal Women's History Project, Joan Gundersen. Our presenter, Dr. Joan Gundersen, is a longtime member of EWHP and currently serves on its board and as Vice President. She has researched and published extensively on the work of Episcopal women in the Church. She has earned degrees from Monmouth College, the College of William and Mary, and the University of Notre Dame. In 2019, the Virginia Theological Seminary awarded her an honorary doctorate of human letters. This talk today will draw on research that she did while serving as the archivist for the Episcopal Diocese of Pittsburgh. So now I invite Dr. Joan Gundersen to lead us through this wonderful series. Joan.
Okay, well, I am sharing a screen there, so I hope that you're all able to see it. I'm going to be talking about Partners for God and for Good, Margaret Cust Schoenberger and Ann Hogg Brunot. Now, the picture that's up there is actually Pittsburgh, about the time the women arrived in Pittsburgh, because they didn't come from there. The two women are both very typical and very unusual. However, neither of them have children. That's one of the ways they are unusual. And both were overshadowed by their husbands. There are strange gaps in what we know and what we don't know about them. And we know much less about one of these women than the other. Ann Hogg Brunot was much more in the spotlight, and she collected evidence of her own activities and left an archival record. Margaret Cust Brunot worked behind the scenes, and I could not even find an obituary for her, despite her prominence in Pittsburgh. There is no archival collections of her activities. There's a very little bit amount in Pittsburgh on her husband. If her husband had not made a grand gesture after her death, she would be completely forgotten. Even his obituary got her last name wrong. So let's begin to meet these women. I've got to get the next slide up here. What happened here? I have to get my slides back up here. What is going on? I'm going to have to stop the share, and I'm going to have to share it again because something disappeared, like my whole presentation. There. Okay, so let's move to our next slide. Should be changing, and it is not changing for me. Let's try, there we go. Margaret Cust was born May 28th in either 1809 or 1810. They don't even agree on the year she was born, in Greensburg, Pennsylvania. Now, Greensburg is right in here. It's south and east of Pittsburgh. Despite being the county seat, Greensburg was a small town under 600 people with very slow growth. There's no information on her as she grows up, nothing until she marries John H. Schoenberger in Kittanning, which is about halfway between Greensburg and Pittsburgh, but it's up this way. And in 1832. John and his brothers were in the process of taking over their father's holdings in iron ore and iron processing. And Katanning was a key point in the shipping of ore to their Juniata ironworks in Pennsylvania, in Pittsburgh. John bought a house and built an imposing house in Allegheny City in 1846, and Margaret moved to Allegheny County at that time. They were both Episcopalians and were active in Trinity Church downtown. Mary Ann Hogg was born to a prominent family in the Brownsville area in 1823. There's Brownsville. She moved with her family to Pittsburgh sometime before 1846, when she married Dr. Felix R. Brunot, the son of another Dr. Felix Brunot, who was a prominent landowner in Allegheny County and an entrepreneur, despite also practicing medicine in both cases, father and son. The couple spent their first year as a married couple in Rock Island, Illinois, where Felix was running a flour mill. During his medical training, despite that training, Felix was an entrepreneur, and Mary Ann brought great family connections on her own. She would inherit her father's property in Allegheny City. Now, today, Allegheny City is part of Pittsburgh. It's on the other side of the Allegheny River from the Golden Triangle downtown of Pittsburgh, but it was entirely separate in the 19th century. Allegheny City, they were across the river, but they very much were a part of the Pittsburgh area. Now, Mary Ann's family appears to have been Presbyterian, but the Brunots were evangelical Episcopalians. One of Felix's brothers was actually, Sanford Brunot was a priest in the diocese. And Mary Ann settled in to Felix's Episcopal Church. And there is the Trinity Church that would have been there when they came in the 1840s. John and Felix attended different congregations in 1846. Here is John, and here's Felix and Mary Ann together. By 1840, although Felix had attended Trinity, by 1846 he was at Christ Church in Allegheny City on the other side of the river from Trinity. John served on the vestry at Trinity and later at another parish, St. Andrew's. John would make substantial contributions to the building of the current Trinity Cathedral in 1872. It would replace the building that I showed a picture of. Now, John and Felix also disagreed on whether the western part of Pennsylvania should be separated from the Diocese of Pennsylvania. When we start this story, there is no Diocese of Pittsburgh. There is a diocese that covers the entire state of Pennsylvania, and the western parts felt very neglected. They sent out an Episcopal bishop about twice a year to run around the area. Felix was very connected, Brunot, to the people in the eastern part of the diocese and opposed the split. John was supporting the idea of a new diocese in the western part of Pennsylvania. That diocese would come into existence in 1865. And so, again, half of our story is done with them as part of the Diocese of Pennsylvania, and half with them as part of the Diocese of Pittsburgh. And that applies, of course, to their wives as well. But that's all getting ahead of our story. John and Felix did, in fact, collaborate on the building of the Allegheny Valley Railroad, which opened in 1857 with track running from Pittsburgh to Katanning. Remember where the Brunots got married? And the Schoenbergs? The Schoenbergs are in Katanning. So they ran along the south bank of the Allegheny River. Eventually, the railroad would expand into the oil country that opened up just again right before the Civil War. There is oil discoveries in Oil City, and that's actually the center of the oil industry in the United States in the middle of the 19th century. So Felix would serve as president of this Allegheny Valley Railroad Corporation, and John served as treasurer. So these two families are economically tied together in varieties of ways. But given Pittsburgh was already one of the major manufacturing places in the United States, and it was filled with smoke downtown and in the city of Pittsburgh. So those families that could afford looked for some place out on the outskirts of the city for summer homes. And so that is exactly what both the Schoenbergers and the Brunots did. John and Margaret, this is their city home. It still exists. And it was here's the Golden Triangle of Pittsburgh, where the two rivers come together to form the Ohio. They bought their summer property in Lawrenceville, which is again part of the city of Pittsburgh today, but is upriver on the edge of beyond where the heavy manufacturing was in the 1850s and 60s. So, and their property was close to the Allegheny Armory, which was during the Civil War, in fact, the main place providing munitions and heavy armaments to the Union Army. It was the center of that activity, and John was their major supplier. So it was nice to be close to where you were working, but it was also right next to the Allegheny Cemetery, which was this huge cemetery that had been developed as a park. That was the idea of cemeteries in the middle of the 19th century. They had started with this idea, and families would go out and picnic there, and there would be grass, and it would be fresh air and green. So they picked a set of lots that were, in fact, here is the Allegheny Cemetery. This is the Schoenberg property. So it backed right up to the cemetery. They also owned big stretches of land here and along here. What did the Brunots do? Well, they went farther out of town. In fact, they went up into the area where I currently live. They went to a town called Verona. It was a major stop on the Allegheny Railroad, which, remember, Felix was the president of. And it's actually where they had their roundhouse and where they did a lot of the work on maintenance of the rolling stock for the railroad. This is the Brunots' summer home. We don't know what the Schoenberger home looked like. It no longer is extant, and nobody had taken a picture of it before that's been recorded anywhere I could find. This is the Hogg, which was Mary Ann's family home in Pittsburgh, and she inherited it. And you can't really see it, but it goes back almost an entire block this way. It's a townhouse. It's shared in the front, and then it goes back, sprawling back this other direction. It was about 17 rooms. So it's not what you would call a modest hovel by any means. At any rate, this is so they're both out in these summer areas. They both had, in fact, lots of land besides the land they built the property on. Here is the property that was where the Brunot house is. You can see the driveways and the actual mark for the house there. But the Brunots own most of this block. Felix owns this lot. He owns this lot. So he owned a good portion of what will eventually be the town of Verona. Meanwhile, both of these families have, in fact, started their philanthropic activities. The men are on numerous charity, civic, and hospital boards, often both serving at the same time on these boards. So we know again that they are entwined in their philanthropic activities in Pittsburgh. But that's not who I'm really interested in. I'm interested in what their wives are doing. Marianne seems to have headed immediately for leadership roles. Now, she began with those that were related to the Episcopal Church, often creating a Western Pennsylvania version of an organization that already existed in the eastern part of the diocese. Now, this is a scrapbook she kept, and it's from 1868, 1869. And these are clippings that were in it. And they show some of the organizations that she was involved with well before the Civil War. Allegheny Ladies Tract Society. The tracts, literally, they're doing religious tracts that they distribute to all sorts of people. And notice that she is the president. Then there was this is the annual meeting of the Pittsburgh Allegheny Orphans Association. They had a home, and it is actually Joan Brunot who will be the president of that association. But all of these charitable organizations, and this is true throughout the United States, almost all of them have a ladies board as well. And it's a ladies management board. They actually are the ones that are in contact with the people that they are serving, and they will make decisions, like they'll decide on what kind of clothing these people get. And they will order the food for the woman that's on site as their matron. And they are directly involved in the running of these organizations. And who is and on that one, Marianne is the president, and then here is her board. And here we have the Ladies' Bible Society and the Prayer Book Society, both of which distribute those publications. And they do so not just locally, they're doing it nationally. They will be shipping prayer books to Western frontier towns, for example, during this period. And they will send them in fairly large quantities to multiple places. It's all part of the evangelical activity of the church at this point. And again, she is the president of the Bible Society. Marianne is also president of the Prayer Book Society. Every time you turn around, she's president. Maybe sometimes she's secretary. So, but that, you will find her as one of the leading officers. And that the scrapbook is one of the ways that she kept track of how many news stories there were about these organizations. Even in this early period, Marianne Brunot is also working interdenominationally. The Allegheny Ladies Bible Society was interdenominational. And once again, who is the president but Mrs. Brunot? Now, she also is working, here she is as secretary for the Prayer Book Society. And that one is an Episcopal organization. So she's, the same time that she's working within the church, she's also doing things that are Protestant Christian related that go beyond the Episcopal Church. Then in 1858-59, there's a little something different that occurs. Margaret and Mary and together gather a group of prominent church members to talk about forming a home for elderly Episcopal women. They will call it the church home. There will be a male board of managers, official board, and there will be a board of lady managers. In the first year, they will incorporate, and in 1859, as they're starting to meet, the first meeting is held at the Brunot home. And then later meetings are held in Lawrenceville. And who has a summer home in Lawrenceville? Schoenbergers. And they will then find property, they'll incorporate, and they will open in a rented property in 1859. By 1862, they have bought a building in Lawrenceville and are running their home that way. And by that time, now, both of their husbands are on the men's board, and both of the women this time, and it's the only time I could find this, Ann Brunot is president, but Margaret is also an officer. And within 3 years, Ann has stopped any office. She doesn't have any offices with the home, although she retains an interest in it. And Margaret Cust Schoenberger will be the president for the next decade. So, and here this is from one of the Pittsburgh directories from that period, and there she is listed as president. This would have been in about 1867 directory, 1867, 1868. Now, this is the home that they finally will build about in the late part of the 19th century. It still exists. It is now part of an even larger medical facility that is called Canterbury House in Pittsburgh and works with those who have Alzheimer's. Now, Margaret took over when the church home expanded to also care for orphans. This would remain their focus. They would have some retiree women, and they would have 20 to 60 children. And so one of the things that's seen as innovative today is when you have a daycare center associated with a nursing home or something, and the older residents actually having contact with the children. Well, they were doing it regularly in the 19th century here at the church home. That would remain the way they would work all the way until the end of the 1940s, when the orphanage closed and they focused on elder care and eventually transitioning to dementia care. And the Episcopal Church would finally lose control of the building after the year 2000, and it would become part of the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center grouping. During the Civil War, these two women also ended up again on a project together. But Ann took a much bigger role here, and Margaret is down the list of people who are cooperating with it. And that is, during the Civil War, John Schoenberger was focused mostly on the Allegheny Arsenal, which had a horrible explosion that occurred in the middle of the war, and there are close to, I think it was 87, mostly young women and who were killed, who were working in the armory. There are a few men that are a part of that were also killed. Felix Brunot turned down offers of commissions in the military to serve as a volunteer doctor on the front lines. And in fact, he will be captured by Confederates. He will spend time in a Confederate prison and finally be paroled back to Pittsburgh. This meant that the families, though, have a very strong interest in the medical side of caring for the casualties and the sick during the Civil War. And the organization that develops nationally to deal with that is a volunteer organization that gets a national charter called the Sanitary Commission. And once again, while men are at the very top of the organization, basically every single branch is run by women, and they do almost all of the recruiting and the funding of the Sanitary Commission. One of the ways they fund it is that they begin to develop these very big fairs, celebrations. And the first of them is in Chicago in 1863. And Mary Hogg Brunot and Rachel McFadden, who had been the contact person basically running the Sanitary Commission's operations in Pittsburgh, were sent to Chicago in order to scope out what this fair was. They came back with their information, and Felix Brunot is appointed as the chair for the whole of the fair. Mary Ann will take a minor role. She will not be one of the officers for the ladies section, but she is listed as one of the managers. And so is Margaret Schoenberger working on that project. John Schoenberger is also, again, one of the people who is in the structure that is running this particular fair. So here it is. We have the Pittsburgh Sanitary Fair. This is actually a piece of music dedicated to Felix Brunot, one of the things they did to publicize it. Here is the actual grounds. It was held in Allegheny City, which is why the Brunots were especially appropriate, because that, of course, was their home base. When you look at the net proceeds of some of the major fairs that were held around the United States, the Pittsburgh one, and Pittsburgh's a lot smaller than some of these other places like New York City, they actually get a higher dollar amount per person attending than any of the others. But it's roughly, it's $323,000, more or less, rounded off, which, if you want to know what that is today, all I can tell you is it's somewhere over 10 million, the equivalent amount of money that they raised. On the inflation calculator I was working with, 1913 is the earliest year you can plug into it, and this is 1864. So there's a fair amount of additional that could be there. So you have these two women that work together on the sanitary fair, along with their husbands. But what you can't tell in this period is how any of these women's activities, how they're managing those and and other roles. What was Mary Ann doing while Felix was a prisoner of war? I mean, she's still listed as the president of all these organizations, but there were a few other things that needed to be handled in that household with him in Confederate prison. How did the Schoenbergers manage their philanthropic duties, and they do have them, while on a grand tour of Europe in 1860? By the way, they were busy purchasing pieces of art while they were there. And how was Mary Ann so involved in the groups that she was helping with? And there's no break in her serving as an officer in any of these organizations from the day they're founded until the day she dies in 1899. There's no break. But from 1868 to 1871, Felix was the federal U.S. Commissioner for Indian Affairs, and they spent a good portion of that time in the West, in places like Montana and Cheyenne and North Dakota, all over where the Indian tribes that he was negotiating with and trying to set up more humane practices and treatment of them during those particular years. She went with the U.S. We have no idea how these roles interacted. But what we do know is what happens after the Civil War, a little bit more. Margaret Cust Schoenberger died in 1878 of breast cancer, and John would die in 1889, 11 years later, having remarried. His wife, he'd only been remarried 3 years when he died, and he had moved to New York City. But John had not forgotten Margaret. He made an $800,000, that's the amount then, not anything translated into current dollars, okay? $800,000 donation to the Episcopal Diocese of Pittsburgh so that they could build and furnish a hospital to be named St. Margaret's Memorial Hospital. He also gave the land in Lawrenceville that it would be built on. Now here's the Allegheny Cemetery. This number 17 happens to be sitting right over the property that, in fact, the Schoenberger's house was on. And this is the property they gave for St. Margaret's, this big long stretch here. And here is the building that they put up for St. Margaret's that was built by the Episcopal Diocese. They used that building until into the 1950s when the Episcopal Diocese built a modern hospital on the other side of the river And eventually that was also taken over by the UPMC behemoth. In addition to that, though, they continue to have a spot in the building where they honor the Schoenbergers. It's one of the few places that you will actually see a picture of Margaret. Now, when John died, he also chose to be buried in the Allegheny Cemetery where Margaret was already buried. And his obituary from the Pittsburgh newspaper has a long thing on all the charities that he did. And then it talks about her as a kind and charitable woman, but gave her last name as Custer. They didn't even get her last name right 11 years after she died. His second wife, Alice, stayed in New York and survives for a long period of time. But John, so he gave not only the $800,000 in cash, but he gave the land that was needed for that particular hospital. And that is why that's the only reason that Margaret Cust has not been completely forgotten, even though the obituary in Pittsburgh couldn't get her name right. Meanwhile, Ann Brunot was moving on to new projects. She was the main spark plug behind the formation of an interdenominational group, evangelical somewhat in its focus, called the Women's Christian Association. Now, that is the origins in Pittsburgh of the YWCA. And she is seen as the founder of the YWCA because of that. She would serve as the president of the Women's Christian Association, which she formed in the early 1870s, and until she died in 1899. She also not only served as the president of the overall organization, which is listed right here with her, Mrs. Felix Brunot, as the president, but what the Women's Christian Association did is that it ran an entire panoply of additional charities, such as the boarding home for working women, the home for destitute women. There are, this is a home that young women who were workers and were coming in and needed time to find a place to stay that was safe, secure, respectable. This is the home in Wilkinsburg for couples that needed, that were impoverished and had children. And there are a number of others and that are various approaches to trying to handle pieces of the poverty and the ways that the Industrial Revolution spit working families out in pieces after they've been chewed up. And so this is just a little sample of the number of things. And in every one of these, she is also the president for the organization that runs the individual specific focus, that particular institution. As a result, for all of that kind of activity, Marianne, and this is a picture of her as she is aging, was also on the state board of public charities. She's one of the very few women, of course, appointed to anything in Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania is one of the states that actually was the worst in including women and most patriarchal of states when it comes to positions of power. But she was on the state board of public charities. That happens to be the way she's identified in this program, which was a National Prison Association. Yes, they also worked with prisoners and prisons as well. So, as she is approaching the end of her life, She is praised and featured in newspaper stories as the mother of charities in Pittsburgh. And one of the things that happens, there's a write-up of her in the 1880s with a sketch that I'm going to show on the next slide. And it talks about her concern for the church home and basically gives her all credit for it. Margaret Cust, by the 1880s, less than 10 years after her death, has been completely forgotten as the co-founder and the leader and the president of that organization for more than 10 years. It all goes under the halo of Ann Brunot. Now, she and Felix, Ann and she, gave contributions to charities all over the United States. After their time out in the West, they are supporting a school in Oregon or Washington State. They're supporting lace work on Indian reservations. They're supporting a variety of, they're supporting work in China. They're supporting Episcopal Church work in Mexico. They are supporting a variety of schools, hospitals all over the country that they regularly give contributions of over $1,000 to $2,000 to, as just the way it goes. Felix died in 1898. And what does Ann do? Well, I mean, let's see, I want to get to, she actually will spend time to publish a biography of her husband. Then she works with the Reverend George Slattery, who was then the dean of the cathedral in Faribault, Minnesota, for the Diocese of Minnesota, but had been a former rector of Trinity Church, of one of the churches in Pittsburgh that the Brunots had attended. And so she knew him from way back. So they got that book published, and she was working on clearing up all of the bequests that her husband had made in his will and making sure that they went out. This particular letter, which was written in September of 1899, so it's one of the last ones that she will actually write, is talks about some of those contributions going out. She's chatting about various things that she's concerned with in the family. And the fact is that they're closing their home in Verona and the summer home, and moving back into the home that they have in Allegheny City. And she's feeling like it's going to be the last time that she will be in that Verona home. This also, there's something very revealing in this letter in one place, and it's because she expresses concern about one of her nieces. And this is why I know that they're on the evangelical side of this stuff, because she's worried about the niece because the niece plays cards on occasion. That may be one of the differences between her and Margaret Cust Schoenberger. The Schoenbergers are in some sense a more sophisticated version. They're the ones that go to Europe. They're the ones that buy art. They're going to be involved in a certain kind of society circle that, in fact, would be playing cards on occasion and might very well be doing some other activities that, like dancing and things, that theater going that the Brunots frowned on. So she's been working to clear up all of that. And then she dies November 2nd of 1899. And unlike Margaret, I can find obituaries for Ann Hogg Brunot in Wisconsin newspapers, in national church newspapers, there is a letter sent in honor of her, and it's actually in Spanish with the darker print here is actually the English translation from Mexico, talking about the support that they received for the Mexican Episcopal Church. The Churchman, which is one of the big national newspapers for the Episcopal Church, featured, this is the length of her obituary there. And this is how much Cornelius Vanderbilt gets. They died in the same period, and they're being memorialized in the same edition of the Churchman. So that may give you an idea of exactly at the time of her death, how well known she was. Her own will lists a long list of donations. Let's see if I've got, yeah, the Pittsburgh newspaper carried it as a headline with Mrs. Brunot's philanthropies, numerable church or charitable organizations she aided in work and so forth. It covered the list of who was getting bequests in her will, took 2 columns in the newspaper. The list, the amount of money that she had to distribute that was hers after Felix had distributed the majority of his wealth was still over $165,000, which translates to somewhere over $6 million in today's money. And again, it went to all sorts of church organizations all over the United States, and every one of the ones that she had worked with in Pittsburgh as well. So what do we make of these women? One was very quickly forgotten because she worked behind the scenes much of the time. She was one of the grunts. She would actually do day-to-day stuff, but didn't want to be an officer. The only thing she was an officer of was the church home. The other was lauded, but now, again, is almost unknown. They had to work within the constraints of their times. So the charities might require residents to do work or pay for some of the food. They were designed to be transitional. The idea was to make them productive citizens if they were younger people. They had to work within the racial constraints of the time. Now, the Brunots will be, one of the charities that they supported was the Freedmen's Bureau. They also, both the Schoenbergers and the Brunots supported the orphanage that was set up for colored children, that's what it was called. So for African Americans within Pittsburgh. So they recognized and extended their charity beyond the racial bounds, but they did it within a segregated society. They held positions for long periods of time, especially Mary Ann Brunot, who just never gave up being president of anything that she was a part of. So there was no transitions of leadership. And Brunot's groups were very tightly focused around her evangelical friends. If you look, you'll see the same in detail. You start seeing the same names repeated in these organizations across a variety of them. Now, they also had to figure out ways to work around the legal constraints on married women and married women's property, which is why they were the lady managers and the men are the corporate board, because that was the way, because if Margaret couldn't hold property in her own right, separate from John in 1846, that would never have happened. She would have had to have it in a trust in order to get around John being in control of it. So but they do find a way, in fact, to have their say. And the kinds of things they do and the charities they sponsor, every one of you, if you go look in your own communities, you will find people women in the 19th century doing the same kinds of things. But it's just that these two women, and especially Brunot, who managed to be in charge of everything, are exceptionally visible in Pittsburgh. Okay, that's where I want to end, and I've got time for questions. So let's see if do we have to get a chat up. I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And I'm going to look and see if we've got some stuff in the chats. Now, somebody here is commenting on the home for working women reminds me of one in Hudson, New York. Yes, you will find them all over the place, similar kinds of charitable activities. Women recognized that there were all sorts of people falling through the cracks in this industrial society. And eventually it will all come together in a more organized manner in the progressive movement in the early 20th century, where in fact they work on much larger scales and try for more larger scale kinds of changes. Some of which, and some of those people will then be part of the New Deal constructions that go on that we are still living with us in terms of a welfare society. But in the 19th century, yes, it's different. So if any of the rest of you have comments or questions, this is a great time for you to talk about them. And I'm going to suggest that if you want, Liz, why don't you let people be unmuted on their own, and if they have a question or comment.
They should be able to unmute themselves. The meeting
Okay.
was set that way this year.
So,
Joan, I'm going to ask you a question to get us started. And that is, if we know of someone in our church or someone in our community that we want to tell the story of, and we are not trained as you are, as historians and people who are really familiar with archives, how do we get started?
well, hopefully soon there will be a small video that I did for the last Historical Society and EWHP and NEHA, the Tri-History Conference that was held in Washington this last spring, which talks about how to do an oral history. And because there are certain legal things you want to do up front in terms of getting permissions. And then you never go into an interview cold. You always do some background. It makes your own questions that you ask of the person better. And it means that you can recognize the places where you might need to follow up because you're sure there's more to the story than they're giving you in the first glance. But you don't necessarily, it's not that you control the interview, because in fact there's wonderful serendipity, things that you will find out about them that you would never have learned and couldn't have followed up before. But if you want to go in and you want to give the other person some idea of what the expectations are, so that they understand what's going to happen and where, for example, your materials, once you have this interview done, where they're going to go, where people would be able to find them. That would be so. Other questions or comments?
Joan,
I
this
have a
is
comment.
Renee Escafri Torres,
Yes.
president of ECW Province 3. Thank you so much for providing this very interesting information. And I wanted to know from you, of these two women, are there any philanthropic activities or things that continue today?
Well, some of the homes that they created have turned into, under the progressive movement, or later turned into social, community centers, and are still operating in Pittsburgh. And certainly St. Margaret's Hospital still functions, and so does the church home as Canterbury Place. And we still, in fact, maintain a chapel both at St. Margaret's and at Canterbury Place that are with the Episcopal Church. But but one of the frustrations for me is when UPMC took over, the records for the orphanage got lost. They weren't, and they won't hand out medical records, so we can't get anything for the elderly that they cared for either.
Oh,
Thank you.
But yes, there are a few of these, and within the Black community, if you look at Black leaders, if you will find them, there are women doing the same kinds of things there. And within the various ethnic groups, again, but you have to really you're going to have to look, because just like for Margaret Cust, they won't get the same play in the media that Ann Brunot did. So I know there was somebody else who was trying to ask a question too, so, or make a comment.
well, I'd like to thank you, Joan. This is Judith Gregory. I haven't seen you all in about 2.5 years. It's nice to see faces. And now that I'm fully retired, I can take part at 3:00 on
Yay.
Thursdays at Lent. So I hope to see you all again next week. So thank you.
Well, and I want to remind people that because we're recording this, there will be a recording. So if you have friends who missed it and you think they would enjoy it, you can tell them to come to our webpage, and there's a section, it's called Telling the Stories, and our Lenten series from the whole 5 years previous, plus this year, will be up there, the recordings for them. So, any other comments? We're getting close to the end, but there's time for somebody else if you've got last licks. Sandra, I guess it's over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Joan. You have no idea what a crash course this was for Joan to get ready for, because yesterday I got a call that we needed to make some accommodations for both weather and hospitalizations. So, Joan, I can't tell you how grateful I am that you worked as hard as you did to pull what you had a framework, but you spent a lot of time making.
I thought I had 2 more weeks.
So that is very much appreciated by all of us. And I think this is a really good example of why this is such an important series, because those of us who don't live in Pittsburgh and don't know the things that Joan knows do know of people in our own communities that need to be remembered, and their stories need to be told. And if we can gain a few tools as we go through this and learn from hearing others' stories how this works, I just really appreciate it. Next week, we have Sarah Peskin and Charles Hoffaker are going to come and speak to us about Frances Perkins. And I don't know about many of you, but right now, one of the hot reads is Becoming Madam Secretary by Stephanie Dray. It's a historical fiction book. And so I have a book club that's going to be reading that. And they're all excited about coming to hear the professional side of this. And I see Sarah on today. So Sarah, thank you. We look forward to that. And then the week after that, for those of you who are daughters or just interested in history, we're going to have Susan O'Brien tell us about the history of Daughters of the King. And that started in the East and came across many years later on the railroad, because Nebraska has early chapters. And I'm going to pull out a picture when Susan's on and show you an original chapter in Nebraska charter was signed by Margaret Franklin. And then the week after that, we're hoping that we can get Mary Christ and Anna Frank back, because Anna Frank is the first native priest, female priest in Alaska. And we really want to hear her tell her story. And then following that, Kim Coleman is going to tell us and introduce us to Sister Charis, who is the last living sister of the Sisterhood of Holy Nativity. And she is an elderly woman, and she is going to be telling us her story. I don't know if Sister will be joining us as well, but Kim will tell her story. And then finally, we're going to have the Reverend Susan Haygood Lee, and she is and has been very involved in the United Nations Women's Caucus. And so that should be a really interesting perspective in terms of something that is truly worldwide. So I'm just really excited about your being here. I hope you'll come back and join us. And if you have any ideas of a story of a woman that you know, someone who has that story in their bailiwick and who would like to tell that story, please let us know, because we're always looking for speakers for the following years. So do we have anybody who has anything that they just burning to say? All right. Well, thank you so much. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you, Joan.
Go in peace. Go in peace to love and serve. Amen.
Amen. Thanks, Joan.